All right. 10, 5. And wait a few seconds, then go.
Thanks everyone for joining us. A couple of technical things. We will be taking questions at the end, so please feel free to drop any that you have into the chat, and they will be harvested by Drew Summit, our tech guru. And I would like to thank him and also Joe Hine, who is also our tech guru, for making this possible. Of all the things that have moved to Zoom this year, this is probably the one that I'm most disappointed that we don't get to do in person. We are here to launch Plough Book's latest graphic novel, Freiheit, which is scripted and illustrated by Andrea Grosso Ciponte, who also did our Luther biography. It tells the story of the White Rose. On February 18th, 1943 in Munich, the siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were, I think, 21 and 25 years old, respectively, were distributing packets of anti-Nazi leaflets they'd written throughout Munich University. Rushing to finish, they scattered the last of the leaflets down from a balcony into the atrium of the university. A janitor saw them. As they were arrested, Hans quickly started ripping up another piece of paper. When the Gestapo reassembled the pieces, they found it to be the manuscript draft of another leaflet, which would have been, I think, the 6th that their very illegal anti-Nazi group, the White Rose, would have printed. That leaflet was written by Christoph Probst, their friend, who I think was 24 years old and was the father of 3 small children. Christoph was arrested several days later and tried along with Hans and Sophie. All 3 were convicted of treason and a few hours later guillotined. Later, the rest of the core members of the White Rose, Alexander Schmorl, Billy Groff, and their teacher, Kurt Huber, were tracked down, brought to trial, and executed. The White Rose had begun less than a year before, when this group of friends bought a cheap early duplicating machine and published the first of their leaflets. But many of them had known each other for years, and they had shaped each other's commitments through conversation and debate. Most of them were committed Christians, and that played a crucial role in their opposition to the Nazi regime and in their nonviolent tactics. Their protest was intellectual and active. They sought to keep their minds and consciences alive in a regime that was attempting to stifle them. And one of the most striking things about their correspondence with each other is the urgency with which they discussed Goethe and Schiller and Augustine, even as they were risking their lives. Here to discuss the legacy of this group and what they might mean for us today are Lisabeth Button, a member of the Woodcrest Bruderhof, where she teaches middle school, Aimee Murphy, the founder of Rehumanize International, who lives in Pittsburgh, Maximilian Probst, who's a journalist. His work appears most frequently in Die Zeit, where he is an editor. He's the grandson of Christoph Probst and lives in Hamburg. Dr. Jennifer Frey is the an associate professor of philosophy at South Carolina State University. She also hosts the podcast Sacred and Profane Love. I'd like to turn this over to Jen, who will get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, Susannah, for inviting me to do this. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about the White Rose and Sophie Scholl in particular, because she's sort of a hero of mine. I want to divide my pretty brief remarks this evening into 2 different but related aspects of our topic. So the first half of my remarks are dedicated to understanding the philosophical and theological commitments of the White Rose movement, at least as these are articulated in the 3rd pamphlet they distributed as part of their resistance to Nazi power. But I don't just want to discuss their ideas. I also want to explore what sort of person is able to realize these ideals in action. And here I'll just focus on Sophie Scholl in particular because I know the most about her. But I just want to focus on the virtues that allowed her ideals to become a kind of praxis for her. And I especially want to zero in on her fortitude or her courage. And I also want to suggest that we should understand her final acts as a kind of martyrdom, where martyrdom is understood in terms of the virtue of fortitude, which is sort of its classical understanding. Okay, so first the pamphlet, the third pamphlet and its main ideas. The pamphlet begins with a Latin phrase, salus publica suprema lex, the good of the people should be the supreme law. It's clear that the authors of the pamphlet do not believe that the laws of Nazi Germany have the good of the people in mind. The exact ways that the laws have deviated is explored in other pamphlets, in particular pamphlet 1 and pamphlet 2, but obviously Nazi war crimes certainly loom large in their litany of complaints. And the next move that the pamphlet makes is to just state that the ideal form of government is a kind of utopia, right? Where utopia is a form of government that allows objective human flourishing to be realized. The greatest utopia is the civitas Dei, the city of God, and the state should seek to model itself on this sort of order, an order that has as its foundation justice. The authors of the pamphlet do not come out in favor of any particular ideal form of government, but they do establish quite clearly that they believe that the purpose of government must be the good of the people, where this is understood both in terms of individuals and their rights and freedoms, as well as the realization of the common good. Now, the freedom of the individual, which it is the charge of government to preserve, is kind of subject to two constraints from their perspective. One is that it has to be sought with other members of the community. So it can't be a competitive or private good. It has to be a common good. And it has to be in accordance with God's will. And I think that it's safe to infer from those two constraints that they are not defending a kind of modern notion of freedom as autonomy or a freedom from constraints on individual self-expression or self-creation, but rather what they are advocating for is the more classical conception of freedom as the freedom to flourish with others under just laws. So you could think of it as a kind of freedom for excellence, rather than just a freedom of individual choice. I think it's plain to see in this pamphlet various Augustinian strands of thought. So not just in the invocation of an ideal of a city of God as the model of political order, but also the inseparable connection between justice and legitimate political rule or authority. So it just brings to mind for me the very famous line from the City of God that without justice, kingdoms are nothing but bands of robbers. So for St. Augustine, justice is not only the aim of political society, but it's also the measure of its success or failure, right? And this is why he would say that an unjust law is no law at all. And similarly, that an unjust government is no real government, but just a collection of thieves. And so it follows out of this that legal authority is not necessarily a legitimate authority, right? It depends on whether the legal authority is actually invoking justice for the sake of the good of the people. To put it in more plain language, might does not equal right. And I think this basic commitment is the hinge upon which all of the pamphlet kind of swings open for us, right? So if you don't accept this, I don't think you're likely to accept much else that's in the pamphlet. Pamphlet 3 also recognizes that ideals are not enough. They're not sufficient. They're necessary, but not sufficient. And that's why after it establishes this kind of crucial Augustinian framework, it immediately shifts to a call for courage. So here's just a quote from the pamphlet. If a person cannot even summon the strength to demand his rights, then there is nothing left for him but destruction. We will have deserved to be scattered to all corners of the globe as dust before the wind if we cannot pull ourselves together in this 11th hour and finally summon the courage that we have been lacking. Do not hide your cowardice under the cloak of cleverness, because every day that you delay, every day that you do not resist this spawn of hell, your guilt is steadily increasing. So what does the White Rose movement advocate that one does in the face of an unjust regime, an illegitimate regime? How does one fight unjust laws? Well, what they advocate in this pamphlet is passive resistance, a kind of nonviolent civil disobedience, or various forms of nonviolent civil disobedience. So they're not advocating for a violent revolution. They're not telling anyone to kill Hitler, but they're rather laying out peaceful forms of what they call sabotage and non-cooperation, right? So there is a demand for refusal to cooperate in any way. And then they list various forms of cooperation that they're especially worried about. Now, the pamphlet, I think, is not so much an intellectual manifesto as it is primarily a call to conscience and a call to action. It invokes explicitly the necessity of personal virtue. And I think the pamphlet clearly has as a background assumption that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, right? That's a maxim that comes to us right out of Plato. And I think that if one truly believes this maxim, that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, then one has to know how to suffer the consequences, right, of injustice and of remaining committed to one's ideals. And here, of course, when we look to Plato, we find Socrates as an exemplar. Socrates himself is put to death by a state who fears his personal convictions. And when Socrates speaks about his convictions, he really just states quite plainly that there is no good, no human good, not even his external freedom or his own life. There is no good that can be worth the price of injustice in his soul. And we find St. Paul saying something very similar in Romans 3:8, right, where he says, we may never do evil that good may come from it. And of course, that would include cooperation with evil. I also find it interesting that both Socrates and St. Paul are martyrs in a very obvious sense, right? They were both witnesses to the truth in their willingness to sacrifice everything for its sake. And that's the sense in which I believe that Sophie Scholl and Hans Scholl and the rest of the White Rose movement were also martyrs. When I was thinking about Sophie's story for tonight, I was also reminded of Franz Jägerstätter, right? The peasant that was made into a martyr by the Nazis. And of course, Jägerstätter's story was recently brought to the screen by Terrence Malick in his absolutely incredible film, A Hidden Life, which everyone should see if you haven't seen already. But there's this one scene in the film that I want to bring up because I think it really just crystallizes the importance of having both courage and love in order to be able to suffer for the truth. So it's actually earlier in the film. So Franz is like, at this point, he's still trying to figure out what he wants to do. Like, should he actively resist the Nazis? And he knows all this bad stuff is going to happen to his family if he does. And he's sitting in a church and he's thinking about it and he's praying about it. And he encounters this artist who's painting in the church. And the artist confesses to Franz that rather than suffer for the truth, he merely paints it, right? And he speaks of, the artist that is, speaks of the people who come into the church thinking that, or maybe assuming that if they lived in the time of Christ, they would not have condemned or denied him, as, for example, St. Peter did. And the artist worries that he's contributing to these fantasies, insofar as what he's painting is a very comfortable resurrected Christ with a halo over his head. And he suggests that maybe someday he'll summon the courage inside of him to paint what he calls the true Christ, the one who suffered in agony on the cross for his love of mankind. And it's really at this point in the film that Franz kind of recognizes what it is actually going to mean for him to imitate Christ, that it's actually going to require tremendous sacrifice and suffering. And the Christ himself is the model of that, right? The Christ himself is what it looks like to suffer in love for the truth. And so I want to think about this in terms of the classical understanding of martyrdom, right? So if you think about what, say, St. Thomas says about martyrdom, he places it within the virtue of courage, of fortitude. And he just says, look, fortitude is that virtue that allows us to remain steadfast in our judgments of reason in the face of fears and afflictions, but especially the fear of death. And he thinks that its principal act is endurance, right? Endurance in the face of suffering. And he also insists that the good of reason, which is the good of human life, is in truth. It has truth as its proper object, and it has justice as its proper effect. And then he says, well, look, martyrdom essentially is standing firmly to truth and justice against the assaults of persecution. And I think that's obviously exactly what Sophie Scholl and Hans Scholl did. And Aquinas also makes another remark that I think is worth considering. And that is that martyrdom is the greatest proof of the perfection of charity or love of God. Since to perform an act of martyrdom, a person must sacrifice what is most precious to him, that is to say, his own life, for the sake of what he takes to be his ultimate good. And, you know, I think Sophie Scholl in particular comes to mind because she has been said to have remained absolutely calm and resolute, even as she approached the guillotine. Her own executioner was very impressed by her demeanor as she approached her death. And I really think this is a testament to the fortitude that she possessed and that enabled her to stick to her judgments of reason, to live what she believed was true. And I think that this heroic fortitude is really her enduring legacy to us, you know, maybe especially as women, maybe especially for our daughters, that she's an exemplar or a model for us to admire and to want to imitate in various ways in our life. And I think that if we want to think about what it means to fight fascism in all of its forms, especially today, it's really not enough to have the correct convictions, that we have to have the courage to resist it in both word and deed.
Thank you so much for that, Jen. Lisabeth, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah. So going on from what Jennifer discussed about the ideals that shape the character of the White Rose, I'm going to talk about my work as a teacher, trying to show my students why these ideals are important. As Susannah said, I've been a history teacher in the Bruderhof High School and Middle School for the past 10 years. And as a Christian school, character education is obviously a big part of what we do, including in our study of history. So I usually include the White Rose as part of our unit on World War II because I think their example is so important to pass on to young people today, and an example that must remain alive. I myself was introduced to the story of the White Rose by my mom when I was a young teen. She felt it was really important for me to learn about sacrifice and courage, and so she gave me the book, The Resistance of the White Rose by Inge Scholl, the sister of Hans and Sophie, which tells their story and includes correspondence and documents from the White Rose. And actually at one point, a woman, Traudl Vollbrecher, who was a student at Munich University at the same time as Hans and Sophie, she came and spoke to my elementary school. And of course, it made a big impression to hear firsthand from someone who had been there on the day that Hans and Sophie were arrested, and she actually had leaflets in her bag, and how she desperately tried to flush the toilet and ended up hiding them under her sweaty gym clothes and charming her way out. And, you know, this story, and from reading about the White Rose, definitely had an effect on the choices I made later in life. And I try to pass these same lessons on to my students now. So tonight, I want to talk about 3 takeaways from the story of the White Rose for teenagers today. First, the importance of heroes. Second, role models. And most importantly, joyful conviction. So the first, heroes. I think today it's more important than ever for young people to learn about sacrificing for a cause greater than oneself. The White Rose and also the Civil Rights Movement, which I just finished teaching my students about, are examples of this. And as they recede into the past, I think that we as educators and parents need to work to keep them alive and relevant to young people. And the past year obviously has been a confusing one, not only for all of us as adults, but also for my students. And I can see them working through things that have happened and trying to sift through the various political lenses, like who's right, who's wrong, where's the hero in all of this. And I think that's one area where the example of the White Rose is really important. Because before they became active in resistance, there was this earnest search for objective truth through reading they did, discussion, and so on. And then they had the courage to act on that search, which of course leads to a discussion of the importance of following your conscience, regardless of the cost. Related to this is that our understanding of the truth can grow over time if we're committed to seeking for it. The fact that the men in the White Rose fought on the Eastern Front as part of the Nazi forces, or even that Sophie Scholl was a member of the Bund Deutsche Mädel, is an important part of the story. But also to point out to young people that heroes come from many different backgrounds. They don't necessarily stand out beforehand. For example, when I was a teenager, Sophie Scholl, resonated with me a lot as this striking young woman who, as Jen mentioned, had a lot of fortitude and courage. But more recently, the story of Christoph Probst has challenged me. The sacrifice that he made as a father of 3 young children is something that for me now, as a mother with 2 children of my own, is really immense. So maybe not all heroes make it into the history books, but I think it's important that we recognize that heroes can just be the ordinary people among us. The next is role models. You obviously can't choose to be a hero, circumstances do that, but you can choose to be a role model. And of course, it's a two-way street, that each person needs to be a role model, but also have role models. So I like to point out to my students how the White Rose, who were really young people, 21, 25, how they sought to live their lives following positive examples from their parents, or they sought out a confidant like Professor Huber, their philosophy professor, and how important it is to look for those role models around us. And of course, you can also see in the interaction among the members of the White Rose, how much they enjoyed being with each other, but also spurred each other on to have courage and faith and daring in believing and acting on what they knew was right. The last lesson is one I think is really important, and maybe particularly reflecting on the anger that we've seen in demonstrations of various types over the past year, and that is joy in life. If you read the Scholl's published correspondence, one thing that's really evident is their zest for life. And of course, a part of that is the high spirits of youth, which my students also excel in. But I think it's really important that their resistance came from wanting to make the world a better place because they loved it. Not from a place of anger, even though anger would have been completely understandable. And I do believe that their joy was a result of their faith. And that's something that was with them to the very end. And there's that heartrending moment when Sophie's mother says farewell to her in the prison. And the last thing she does for her daughter is to remind her of Jesus and says, Sophie, denk an Jesus. So I teach the story of the White Rose as part of our unit on World War II. And I have my students read Inge Scholl's book, and we watch the film The Final Days, which is always a bit of a harrowing watch, but I think is really important. It follows the arrest and trial of the Scholls and of Christoph Probst. And in future years, I'll definitely be adding Freiheit to the unit, as I think it's an excellent introduction to the story in a medium that's perfect for teenagers. But to end our studies of the White Rose, I always have my students write a reflective essay. And I wanted to close out with 2 excerpts from this past year, which just resonated with me. This is from a 12-year-old boy. He writes, "It is important that the story of the White Rose is remembered because it shows to what extent the Nazis went to destroy any opposition to their regime. It illustrates that if you are brave enough to stand up to acts you think are wrong, even if it can eventually lead to death, then you should speak out according to your conscience, as well as encourage others who believe in the same." And to close with, from a 13-year-old girl, "This is the ultimate courageousness. It says, although others are too cowardly to say what they believe in, we will. Something deep inside you knows something is wrong, but you keep pushing it away because you are too scared to confront the hard truth. The message of the White Rose won't quit nagging at you until you acknowledge it and take action." So back to you, Susannah.
Thank you, Lisabeth. Max, it's over to you. And I think we were going to have a bit of a conversation based in part on a piece that you wrote for Plough, for the magazine, a couple of years ago. We've talked a bit about heroes, and your piece, in your piece, you actually criticized the idea of the everyday hero, the kind of Joseph Campbell style self-understanding that we are all on a hero's journey to self-actualization. Jordan Peterson is probably the most recent figure who's promoted this idea. Can you talk about the basis on which you criticize this pop heroism? What's wrong with that, and what is true heroism?
Yes, thanks. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. So I'm really touched to listen to you talking about the White Rose in the US, and it's really great. Thank you so much. So I criticized this idea because I saw somehow a kind of inflation using this notion of hero. So everybody seems to be a hero nowadays, and I think that doesn't work because heroes really sacrifice something or take a risk, and this risk may be losing your life and not just some personal things. And so and I think actually it would be great to live in a society where we don't need heroes. So I think a hero is like the last, the ultimate thing in a society which has actually gone way too far in the wrong direction. So, and I think to be a hero is so difficult. Most of us just can't be heroes. We have our ordinary lives, and this is great. And actually, I don't want to be a hero. I'm fine not to be one. And I think I think what we can do is prevent that we have conditions where heroism is urgent. So we need to have like a small heroism of collective action, so we can have a society where we don't need the heroes.
You've also written against the kind of what I'd say is the urge to debunk, the urge to, quote, pull true heroes down from their pedestals, because that seeks to comfort us with the false reassurance that we can remain as they are. Yet it's only through realizing how much heroes differ from us by virtue of their heroic deeds that we gain the ability to grow through their example. And you actually quote Carlyle approvingly, "Does not every true man feel that he is himself made higher by doing reverence to what is really above him?" That actually seems to be pushing back a little bit against the ideal of the non-heroic ideal, because it seems to me that you're saying that there is something in the heroic ideal that we need in order to have something good drawn out of us, even if, it is better that we live in a society where that's not put to the ultimate test the way that it was with your grandfather. So if we cannot and should not all be heroes, what can we do? How do you make the most of your humanity? How do you not waste your time? And is there a relationship between our ability to love and admire heroes rather than pull them down, and how we live as non-heroes and how we may react if we're called on to step up.
I see them kind of like it's an inspiration to worship some heroes, and we know we can't be like them, but we can just try to live upright and in a good manner. And I think nowadays we have like the big challenge of a society which is under pressure, that democracy is under pressure from soft authoritarian systems and states, and we see that in Turkey, in Hungary, in the US, also even in Germany. So that's not fascism, which we have to fight at the moment, but it's what I would call soft authoritarianism, and it's quite different. So it's not that we don't risk, if we fight this kind of a system, we don't have to risk our lives, but we can do it in organizing political movements, and we can just try to act collectively. And I think mostly it's about this kind of small heroism. What I'm talking about is we need to find a way how the society can be like find some kind of social justice again, and I think every little step in that direction is already kind of a small step preventing this kind of system where heroism then would be necessary. And I think this is great inspiration if we see a kind of a hero like Sophie Scholl and really try to do our best to prevent that this will be necessary again.
Thanks. One thing that the White Rose was distinguished by was that their hatred of Nazism was based, at least it seems to me, on love. They loved each other and they loved Germany. In earlier of I think in the first pamphlet, it's a less universalist call, and it's much more based on they quote Goethe and Schiller, and they attempt to kind of remind their readers as Germans of what Germany ought to be, and indict the Nazi regime based on its corruption of this country that they love. And they love the good and justice, as Jen has discussed, and they had a conviction that it was the role of the polity to point us to the common good and even to the highest good. And they loved God, who is the highest good. But as you say, contemporary political life in parliamentary democracies, again, your original piece seemed to be a bit less keen on at least the way that they can lead us to lower our sights, to seek our own material well-being, to vote in our own interests. And we tend to be suspicious of love of country and of the claim of an objective common good. All of these ideas on which the White Rose was founded seem to us to have even potentially the flavor of something dangerous that the White Rose was founded to overturn. So are those goods that your grandfather sought too dangerous for us in an age where we above all fear falling back into fascism? Or is it still possible for us to love those goods and to trust that they won't lead us astray?
I think they loved their country, yes, that's right, and they loved, of course, God. And I think that's still a great thing to do, and especially to love the country. We have now all this kind of talk like make America great again, take back control and whatsoever. But this is, of course, not patriotism. This is just like a
jingoism.
Yeah, and chauvinism and so on. But the real kind of patriotism, I think, is always in a cosmopolitan direction. So you love your country, but just like you love other countries too. And I think that's what the White Rose did. So they had already an idea of universalism, of course, and of even of a political European federation, what now the European Union is actually. They had this kind of thing already in mind, and I think this is and they not started with the idea of a European Union, but they started with a love with their country. So but so that's not a difference between patriotism and cosmopolitanism. And I think you can have just like both. So I figure like the love to your own country is like you have a room for your own sometimes, but why do you need a room for your own? Because you want to go out. So, and it's just not just to stay always in your room. So, and I think that's still very good and a good idea.
We'd actually talked about whether you'd be okay with me asking this part of the question, or this question earlier, and you said it was. So your grandfather was, I think, the only one of the White Rose who was not, at least earlier on, particularly a Christian. Can you talk about how that changed and how you understand that part of your legacy, or that part of his legacy?
Yeah, his father was quite a open-minded man, and he was like from the in the art scene, living with artists like Klee and Emil Nolde and German painters, which he actually admired a lot, his father. And he grew up with all these kind of people around him, my grandfather. And then his father studied Sanskrit and Pali, ancient Indian languages, to read the Buddhist texts. And he was very much interested in Buddhism. So my grandfather, Christoph Probst, had a second name, was called Ananda. And Ananda is the best friend of Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha. So he came from a totally different background. It wasn't so much about Catholic religion or so in Bavaria, but it was very like open-minded and in every direction. So I think he never went to the church or anything like this. But then at the last day, he was baptized, and I don't know actually why, and I think it's because of somehow because of his friends, and because he wanted to be connected actually, and to be with his friends and with his family. Some parts of his family were Christians, others not. But so, and I think he had God was for him just the idea of the universal, of something everybody belongs to, and I think which is also the old meaning of the word katolon, which in the ancient Greece, that's just a notion for the common, what we all have in common. And I think in this sense, he was always like a Catholic, because he wanted to promote universal love, universal values, and this is for what he acted. And in this sense, I'm Protestant, but just because I grew up Protestant with my mother and my father in Hamburg, which is a Protestant city. But in this sense, I'm also, of course, a Catholic. So like following a philosophy of the commons. So.
Thank you so much for that. Aimee, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and we're actually going to have a sort of a similar conversation. So I guess we can get started with that. So can you tell us about Rehumanize, what brought you here today, beginning with your own story, and just tell us who you are.
Yeah. So I founded what is now Rehumanize International as Life Matters Journal back when I was 22, about 10 years ago, because I decided that I couldn't be done doing activism for human dignity. Because when I was 16 years old, I had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with a guy. And on Valentine's Day, about 16 years ago now, he raped me. And then March went by, April came, and hadn't had a period. And he threatened to kill me if I didn't have an abortion. And in that moment, I realized that violence could not be the solution. That what he was telling me was, you're an inconvenience to me, you're an inconvenience to my future, therefore I'm going to kill you. And I realized that I couldn't be like him, that I couldn't pass on this system of oppression onto another defenseless human being. So then and there, I was 16 years old, I became very begrudgingly pro-life, and just like anti-violence in general. Since then, I've come to say that I became so unsettled by systems of oppression and violence that it's been my goal to go and unsettle the rest of the world, because being comfortable in a world where violence and oppression and discrimination are so common is really a sign of apathy and a sign of complicity with these violent systems. So went to college, was involved in pro-life and human rights activism. And when I graduated, I recognized how much time I had had as a college student. I think a lot of college students don't understand just how much time and opportunity they have to get active and to really take their philosophy to the streets like the White Rose did. And I think that's something that really spoke to me. Right after I started Life Matters Journal, a friend of mine, Lisa, and another friend, Phil, both told me this story about Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. And Phil already had a White Rose tattoo. So eventually I got my own. I don't know if you can see it. It's my White Rose tattoo. Because their influence really meant so much to me as a young activist who was doing this work to promote nonviolence, to promote human dignity, to promote the common good through nonviolent means, through education, through discourse, and ultimately also through action. So it's grown ever since. I actually recently stepped down as executive director. I'm just the director of publications now. So it's our 10th year, and we're really excited for what's coming.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the approach that Rehumanize takes, what a consistent life ethic is, and what the role of a sort of holistic idea of peace means in that context?
Yeah, so Rehumanize International as an organization is dedicated to bringing about a culture of peace and a culture of life. And in so doing, to end all forms of aggressive violence against humanity, whether that violence is abortion or war or torture or euthanasia or embryonic destruction or police brutality or like violence against refugees. Like I could go on, capital punishment. I'm sure I'm forgetting things. Basically with this understanding that each and every human being shares this inherent dignity, this inherent value and inherent worth just by virtue of being human, that there's nothing that you can do or no amount of inaction that could cause you to lose your dignity as human. So in opposing all these different forms of violence, we are nonpartisan or transpartisan or interpartisan, whatever you want to call it, where we don't have a political party because we understand that to end all forms of violence, we really do need to be a movement of every human standing for every human, that we need to be inclusive not only in terms of which humans' rights we're working for, but also in terms of who we're working with to achieve that end. So, we have people on our team who come from all sorts of different backgrounds. I wanted to make sure when I founded the organization that it would have been a place that I would have felt comfortable when I became pro-life and pro-nonviolence at 16, because I was and am openly gay. I was an atheist back then, and I, was and am still like a pretty progressive person politically. And so the pro-life movement didn't feel comfortable. It didn't feel like a space where I belonged. And I was telling Susannah earlier, I have this book, How We Show Up. And in it, there's this line from, I believe it's James Baldwin. Yeah, he wrote, "The place in which I will fit will not exist until I make it." And I think that really has been the case for Rehumanized, because I haven't seen a really active, holistic activist organization that's dedicated to opposing all forms of violence and really standing up for human dignity in all circumstances, and working with folks from all sorts of different backgrounds. So I feel like in creating Rehumanize, we really work to create that space where all sorts of folks would feel welcome to work with us for an end to violence and for, rehumanization of all those who have been subject to violence and oppression.
Thanks so much. You also told me something else that you had found in that book like yesterday about the word Freiheit. So do you want to share that?
Yeah, so I was telling Susannah, I have a copy of Freiheit on my bookshelf. And it's displayed, library style like this. So the big Freiheit is always visible. And it hit me when I was reading this other book, How We Show Up. There's a definition, etymology description, I guess that's in here, from this book, Liberty and Freedom, A Visual History of America's Founding Ideas. And it explains that the word free, which, Freiheit is also, etymologically related, is derived from the Indo-European root Freya, F-R-I-Y-A, which can be also spelled Priya with a P, which means beloved. And friend also shares the same common root with freedom. And it goes on to explain that a free person was someone who was joined to a tribe of free people by ties of kinship and rights of belonging. Freedom was the idea that together we can ensure that we all have the things we need: love, food, shelter, and safety. And it really hit me how that definition points to, I think, the common good that the White Rose was really all about. That freedom is not freedom to do whatever we want. It's not this absolute autonomy that exists to harm others, but it is a freedom to love and serve others. It is a freedom for the common good. So not only a freedom from violence, but a freedom for the common good. And that really struck me because I think it is ultimately the message of the White Rose.
Thank you so much, Aimee. That was amazing. And thank you. Thank all of you. So I guess what we're going to be doing now is just kind of everyone unmute themselves, or I guess don't unmute yourself until you talk, but be prepared to unmute yourself. Get your finger on the clicker or whatever it is. And is there anything that any of you want to ask each other based on what you've just heard?
Sure. I have a question. Okay. Maximilian, I'm going to be honest. When I found out you were going to be on this panel, I fangirled. I cried. Like, I was so excited. And so I guess I'm just curious, like, how did your grandfather's martyrdom impact your upbringing and your family life? And I guess just like the values that were passed on to you.
Yes, that's a difficult question. I think first of all, it was for my father, of course, a traumatic thing. So he grew up without his father, and he came to a boarding school, was even separated from his mother. So I think he was kind of, he didn't talk so much, something, and he wasn't so about going on to the life and taking what he wanted. He was always a little bit shy, as if something could happen to him. I mean, he was just it was traumatic, of course. So, and I think he gave that in a way to us. We have to be like careful. And something can always happen. We have to be prepared, something of this kind of stuff. But then he was, of course, very deep inside the literature and all that which our grandfather read, and much more, of course, because his life is so much longer now. And he showed us the love to the culture, to the freedom, to all the European great literature, of course. So and also to the churches. He always went to us to the churches, and not just like, he wasn't so, maybe a little bit similar to my grandfather. He wasn't like praying, or I don't know, but he just wanted to be with us in churches and show us the art of the churches and just sense what is around, and that was, I think, deeply for me inspiring. And then I think it was, we had like, well, he didn't talk so much at home, but we attended, of course, all kind of memorial meetings, and came together with all the other families of the White Rose, and once a year, and yes, that was really great. And I think for me, it was always my point of view that whatever I do, I somehow have to be in the shadow of my grandfather, but in a good way. I try to be, to live that in some kind of way. Although I know I can't be a hero, but I just can try to do my best.
Anyone else have any questions for anyone else? I've got one, which is that, Lisabeth, you were talking about the kind of confusion of the last year in terms of trying to figure out kind of who the good guys are almost, and just how to respond to all of the political turmoil and various kinds of violence in service of various causes, which can seem to be, which are themselves good. I guess the story of the White Rose and the power of the idea of being anti-fascist is extremely, great, even for us in America, and even this many years on. It almost seems as though everyone is trying to position themselves as the new anti-fascists, or to cast themselves in the role of the White Rose. So it seems to me that it's kind of important to figure out what exactly it is that it means to be anti-fascist, and what exactly it is that how to recognize people, how to recognize in ourselves what it means to act in the spirit of the White Rose, as opposed to maybe defining ourselves by having the right enemies. And I wondered if, Jen, you had any ideas. Basically, are there any things that you can sort of, how can we tell who the good guys are? Or is that the wrong way to think about it? Or yeah, I guess, or anyone. But I was sort of thinking of Jen.
Oh, wait, so
yeah.
Are you asking, like, how do we know who the fascists are?
No, not really, not so much. How do we know when we're acting in the spirit of Sophie Scholl, as you described it? How do we know if we are sort of accurate in, how can we take on that mantle, maybe in terms of the character traits that we display, as opposed to having the correct enemies, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's the first stage is always figuring out what you actually believe, right? And so that is to say, having a well-formed conscience. Now, I think, and I think that members of the White Rose movement are sort of part of a tradition that thinks that on some general level, conscience is natural, right? That there are some things that you can just see, that are wrong. That is to say, to be avoided in action. like murder, various forms of violence. But I think it's when you get into the particular, right, of your circumstances and your situation that you're not always clear about how the general applies, right? So this was in Malick's film, In a Hidden Life. This was like the first half of the movie. The first half of the movie is Jägerstätter just trying to figure out if being killed, as he knows he will be, like if being killed by the Nazis is really the way to go. Everyone is telling him not to do it. Like literally everyone. The priests are telling him this. The bishops are telling him this. Is why, everyone's saying, don't do this. It's stupid. But he feels in his heart, that it's wrong. He cannot escape it. At the end of the day, he knows that giving an oath of loyalty to Hitler is wrong. And he simply cannot avoid this. He cannot avoid this fact of what his conscience is telling him. And of course, that's a deeply personal thing for everyone, right? When you come to that moment, I think Aimee, said something similar, like where you very begrudgingly adopt a political position that you don't, you might have all kinds of reasons to resist, actually. But you've come to see that it's the correct one. And I don't think that there's anything that you can say beyond that it is morally imperative that you follow your conscience. So this is part of classical teaching, that even when your conscience errs, you should follow it. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Right? If your conscience is telling you something wrong, wouldn't it be better if you acted against your conscience? And the answer is no, because this is your basic moral capacity. And if you go against your most basic moral capacity, then you're going against yourself as a human being. You're like going against your very own humanity. Mm-hmm. And so I think, all you can do is struggle to figure out what you think is right, and how you do that depends on the tradition that you're working in, mm-hmm. Working from. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that there's anything you can do beyond that. Now, in terms of actually having the stuff to live out your conscience, I think, part of that, when we think about heroism, right? When we think about heroic virtue, I think it's a matter of grace, at least partially. It's something like a gift. And so there's nothing that you could do to earn that kind of courage. I think in some sense it's a gift.
Aimee, I guess one of the things that we did talk about earlier that you didn't quite directly address in your talk was the idea of rehumanization as something to be done. And can you just discuss a little bit kind of how you understand being a human being and what the process of what dehumanization is and what rehumanization work is?
Yeah. So I think dehumanization is often rooted in a desire to gain a sort of power. And it's something that I think Jennifer talked about earlier, this idea of the legal power is might, but might doesn't always make right. And this dehumanization, often starts with dehumanizing language, and there's definitely instances historically of dehumanization of Jewish people in the especially the first part of the wave of trying to get the Jewish people to leave Germany, and then in the effort to cause violence against them with pogroms and things like that. there's all sorts of different ways that Jewish people were called parasites or non-human or subhuman. And rehumanization, I think, begins with calling a human what they are, which is a human being. Rehumanization is an act of restoring to a human being who has been dehumanized to that status of dignity and respect that they deserve, that is inherent to them, themselves as members of the human family. I think the thing we talked about that really stuck out to me earlier was that we talked about rehumanize and why we chose the name. I was on a long distance call while driving for 2 hours of the 4-hour trip from Ann Arbor, Michigan back to Pittsburgh. And I was on the phone with our current executive director, Herb. And we were like, oh, what should the new name of the organization be? And there were a lot of different weird things that were being, thrown against the wall to see what stuck. And ultimately, I said, it needs to be a verb. Whatever it is, it needs to be a verb, because we need to tell people that this work is action. It's not just talking about it. It is something that you go out and do day in and day out. And I think this sort of relates to our political discourse around voting too, because a lot of people view voting as this political end. And I view voting in a very different way, as one potential political beginning, where we should be doing action day in and day out. We should be living justice and rehumanizing those in our communities through local action, because ultimately all politics is local, and your vote is going to have an infinitesimally small impact on the outcome of any given election. But the things that you do to love your neighbor and community are ultimately the things that are going to make an impact.
Thank you, Aimee. I think what we should probably do now is turn to some of the questions from the audience. This is, I guess, pretty much towards Max. Did the group ever connect with other resistance groups in Germany? Was there any, like with Bonhoeffer, with other religious leaders in Germany? Were there interconnections there that you know of?
Yes, they tried to connect and with the Red Chapel, the Rote Kapelle, which was communist, not only communist, but parts of them were communists, others not. And then they even tried to connect to the 20th July, which is also the biggest resistance group in Germany. So there were all kinds of, they tried, but they didn't reach. And but they had a little part in Hamburg also. There's one part of White Rose in Hamburg too. So that was quite not just idealistic and without. They had also a political view, and they knew what to do, and that. So they had little options, but I think they tried quite good. Yes.
This is, I guess, I kind of want to direct this to Jen. How should the example of the White Rose affect our understanding of Romans 13, which is let every person be subject to the governing authorities, and to the teachings about it by various churches? And I guess to nutshell it, like, what does resistance to an unjust government mean in the context of the general idea that it is good to obey government, and that we are commanded to?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm inclined to take the Augustinian Thomist line that it's not a real government, right? If there's no justice, it's a band of robbers. So there's always a question of, so I don't believe, and of course, I'm sure that various Christian traditions, I mean, I'm thinking with the Roman Catholic tradition, I should just be honest about that. It was never the teaching of the church that you follow that you follow government blindly, right? Because of, well, natural law. Our capacity. So if you think about the church's concept of law, it's an ordinance of practical reason directed to the common good, promulgated, right, by the relevant authority. And in the case of natural law, which is the law that governs our ability to reason, insofar as we do this, we are participating in the eternal law, right? So it is to follow God, to reason properly, and to avoid what we can naturally understand as good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it was always part of that tradition that an unjust law is not a law.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a law, properly speaking, if it's not ordered, if it's not in accordance with reason to the direction of the common good. Now, I see the third pamphlet as squarely in that strand. And of course, there are Protestant strands of that tradition too, because you don't have to go to Aquinas. It's right there in Augustine. And it's also right there in the early fathers.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose I would suggest that that's not a very good reading. Paul, right? Who also says, that we may never do evil, that good may come. And of course, it was always part of Christian teaching that there are some things we can never do because they violate the commands, or because they violate the commandments. And so, insofar as something that presents itself as a government is asking you to do something that is out of joint with what God commands of you, or what Christ commands of you as a Christian, then there is a higher authority. And so I don't see any kind of legal positivism here in the Christian tradition. There is always a higher authority for us. And at the end of the day, we know that to whom we owe everything.
Yeah. And ultimately, there is also, we ought to obey God rather than men. And obviously, every one of the apostles ended up essentially some sort of dissident because of a refusal to let their commitment to Christ and their consciences cave.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, the apostles knew way more deeply than we do, that the relevant authorities, right, might be the agents of your persecution as Christians, right? And that in that situation, of course, you don't do what they're asking you to do, which is to renounce Christ and to worship false gods, but you allow yourself to be crucified.
That actually brings me to, I guess, my next question, which can go to anyone. So we've talked about heroes today a lot, and we've talked about martyrdom. How does the figure of the martyr open up imaginative fields for action that the secular figure of the hero excludes? And I guess one way to spin that, and I'm not sure if this is what the questioner had in mind, was the idea of there being a reality that death can't kill. The idea of there being something that death can't take from you, that is more valuable than physical life immediately. But it also might be, the question also might suggest something different to some of the rest of you. So again, how does the figure of the martyr open up imaginative fields for action that the secular figure of the hero excludes? Go for it, Jen.
Right, just because I have written a lot about martyrdom. So, I mean, I have a conception of the martyr in which you don't have to be a Christian to be a martyr. So I would consider Socrates a martyr, right? So because he's a witness to the truth, and is willing to sacrifice everything for its sake, because he sees that the truth is, his good as a human being. And that any kind of life that he could have in which truth is compromised in some important respect is not a life worth living, right? And so I have, but is Socrates a secular figure? Well, of course not, right? But the Homeric heroes aren't secular figures either, but they're not martyrs in the same sense. So I think it's like, and I'm also fine to say that a martyr is, I guess, a certain kind of hero, insofar as in the tradition that I'm thinking with, we do make a distinction between ordinary virtue and heroic virtue. Mm-hmm. And heroic virtue is the stuff that the martyrs have. We don't expect that from ordinary people, although it's incredible, when it comes out. So like the saints have heroic virtue. Mm-hmm. And of course, every martyr is a saint, but, I think within that framework, we think about grace, right? We think of that kind of courage. There's ordinary courage, which everybody needs and can have. And then there's heroic courage or extraordinary courage. And I think it's incredibly important. I think it's incredibly important to expose children, to these stories, even very young children, because it does fundamentally change their imagination. Mm-hmm. It reconfigures how it shapes that to which they might aspire. And if they're children in a faith tradition, it shapes that for which they might pray, right? I pray for the courage of Sophie Scholl. God, please give me that kind of courage if I were ever in a situation where it was called upon. It fundamentally shapes their conception of what's possible for a human being. Mm-hmm. It is possible to die for what you believe in. It's a possible thing. It's possible to die for Christ. This is why it's so important to expose children to these stories, because it fundamentally shapes their imagination, and their imagination fundamentally shapes what they hope for and what they wish for. And then frankly, at some point, it fundamentally shapes their deliberation. Mm-hmm. And I think exposing them to martyrs, whether the martyr is Socrates or St. Paul, they're both martyrs. They're both ideals of a good human life. I think it's very important.
Aimee, you had an answer, I think.
Well, it's related to this theme of martyrdom, and this is going to be spicy. So I'm sorry ahead of time because it's going to be spicy. I saw a tweet from some person on weird Christian Twitter recently. And it asked the question, do you think that the framing or understanding or knowledge of and perpetuation of stories of martyrs within, especially, I would say particularly, within the Christian tradition, which is a tradition that the United States was particularly formed in, has been harmful for the current and even historical Christian churches in responding to the sins perpetuated by Christians in this nation. Because I think we do have a very different context here in the United States than the White Rose did in Germany when it comes to a Christian understanding. And granted, there are definitely Christian anti-fascists here in the United States, but I tend to think that a lot of the like mainstream evangelical culture has been poised to view Christians as martyrs in a culture war. And that often ends up in Christians persecuting people of color or LGBT people, for example. And I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know if it's a question, it's just a point, and I think it's something that we need to contend with and think about is in viewing or, you know, perpetuating these stories of martyrs, which are good stories, right? Like, I'm literally related to a martyred saint in the Catholic Church as well. Like, I have this history, but as viewing that instead of histories of penitence, something that we need to consider when it comes to Christians in America.
That is a fantastic question. And I feel like it gets a little bit at what I was trying to ask before, which is like, how do we make sure that we're not the bad guys, kind of?
Yeah.
Or how do we make sure that we're acting in ways that are in accord, not just with being on the right side, but actually rehumanizing each other, I guess is a way of putting it. And in a way that, as Lisabeth was talking about, is kind of that joyful and fundamentally peaceful in a not just nonviolent, but in a holistically peaceful sense. Yeah, if any of you guys, Lisabeth, do you have any response to that? It kind of sounded like you were.
I was just going to go back to the question about heroes versus martyrs. And I would just add that I think that what Christianity allows us is that it is possible for a very humble person to be a martyr to truth. And I think that's why, you know, the members of the White Rose were not only heroic, but they were also martyrs in a very humble way, one that they never expected or were looking for when they set out on their journey to speak up for what they believed in, but in the end cost them the ultimate sacrifice. So I also think that's important to remember, is the humility that can go along with being a martyr to truth.
And I don't know, like, it also seems to me that there's a kind of something that Max was warning against, a kind of grandiosity that we can potentially fall prey to if we're like looking to see ourselves as heroes. The kinds of character that we, and the kinds of ability to see others as made in the image of God, as inherently valuable, those aren't going to serve us poorly. Whereas a kind of vision of yourself as like a world historical figure might end up serving you poorly if you don't have the rest of that kind of that broader sense of freedom, as you know, according to the definition that Aimee found earlier today, or found yesterday. Yeah, I think that was a really good question to bring up, Aimee. Thanks for doing that. Does anyone else have any sort of, I don't know, further, go for it, Jen.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that martyrdom isn't just like a formal thing, right? So we don't look to these stories because there's just a similar structure there. I mean, as a philosopher, I always look for the formal structure, but it's really the content and the people that we look up to. And of course, there are all kinds of bad people in the world. I don't agree that Christians are especially the worst among them, but certainly in the US context, you know, we have a problem with political ideology and a problem with political idolatry amongst Christians, but they're not alone in that problem. That is to say, it's not a uniquely Christian problem. And I think, you know, when we look to particular people like Socrates or like St. Paul or like Sophie Scholl, yes, we see a similarity in that they're witnesses to the truth, but we look at the particular things that they were willing to sacrifice themselves for, right? And we also see another commonality, and that is that for each of these persons, humility was actually key. You know, who said that humility is the beginning of all wisdom? That was Plato, right? That was Socrates. That was so. I mean, I'm just not sure the value of questioning heroic stories for children. The problem with children today isn't that they're being called to heroism; it's that they're not. And so I guess I don't feel the force of the problem as much. Yeah.
I'm going to be honest. I was really trying to draw out a point, and it was about humility and how humility is crucial in the character of the martyr, for authentic martyrs, right? And
and I agree. I totally agree. And I think it's a broader point about virtue. You know, like no one would actually be virtuous if they were like really proud about their virtue, you know, like, ooh, look at my virtue. I'm so much more virtuous than you. That's like the first time that you have no virtue. And of course, human beings are very proud creatures, like all of us, you know, where it's like the main vice. But I don't think, and of course, it's always important to like be wary of that, to look out for it in yourself and others. But I don't personally think that's a reason not to share these stories or be suspicious of them, because I just think they play too fundamental a role for us, you know, in giving us exemplars, giving us aspiration, giving us a vision of what's possible, you know, that's really surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was bringing up the tweet because I think that ultimately, like, the point that I was trying to make, and by drawing out conversation on this, was that humility and like how we love each other in small ways really does ultimately give us the virtue and position us, or would position, I guess, the martyr to like actually be a martyr and not just like someone who died proudly. Right.
Yeah. And I think just one follow-up. Malik is so brilliant at this, right? Because the main thing that everybody keeps saying to Jägerstätter in his movie is, you will die and no one will notice, right? You will be guillotined in a garage on the edges of Berlin, and the war will keep going and Hitler will still be in power. Why are you doing this, right? And like really the whole thrust of the film, you know, is that it is the unseen acts of heroism that are the most important, right? That it's actually part of what's so inspiring about him is that it was hidden. That the world didn't notice his death. And so I think that was always baked into the narrative, you know. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I have to, I feel like I want to, this is kind of a leading question, but it's also kind of just like something that's been nagging at me after reading Max's piece. Christoph did not want to die, and he actually fought pretty hard for his life, in part because he loved his children, and he loved his wife, and he did not want to leave them. And it seems to me that there's a pretty strong distinction between the suicide and the martyr. And the martyr is not someone who does not love their life or their children. The martyr is someone who that love is taken up is part of a bigger love. And I wondered if you're able to experience yourself as loved by your grandfather because of what he did, or if that's something that you've thought about.
Yes, I think so. I think that's exactly how you right. As you said it, it must have been some kind of a bigger love around, and I think he did it for his family, for his and not only for his family, but for the greater good and maybe for the history. So I think he was actually one of the few person in that moment who was working on a vision of Germany which we now can live. So that it took like 20, 30 years later, it was just what he thought about Germany, and then it came true. But after the war, but he was actually quite in the future when he did what he did. And I think this is extraordinary. So to have not just to live in the present, but to actually know, to have a vision of the future, how things should be and maybe will be, and I think this is what is for me one of the most inspiring things, and not to look just at the life around me, which is of course very important, but how could life be in 20, 30, 40 years? What do we have to do now to secure that the life in 30, 40, 50 years is still worth living? And I think for me, this is actually the biggest question of all. And it's the question about climate change, climate disaster, which we are heading to, and what can we do with, about that? So, and for me, this kind of a time period, not to be just in the present, but just to be also in the future is very, very important.
Yeah. I kind of want to wrap us up now. It's been really wonderful to talk with you all tonight. Again, I just would like to invite everyone who's joined us tonight to get a hold, if you would like to, of a copy of Freiheit, which is looks like the image is reversed there because of technology. But go to plough.com and check it out. It should be easily available at this point. And the text of all 6 of the pamphlets is included in English translation in the back. So that also will give you sort of more of the primary sources there. And I kind of wanted to just wind up with reading, and I'm thinking of that broader vision or that broader definition of freedom, which includes not just freedom to do what you will, but freedom to do the good, and freedom to be the freedom that is living in friendship with others, that Aimee told us about when I'm reading this. This is a quote from the end of the first pamphlet, which they decided to just use as a kind of epigram. This is from Goethe's The Awakening of Epimenides. And Hope is speaking. Now I find my good men are gathered in the night to wait in silence, not to sleep. And the glorious word of liberty they whisper and murmur, till in unaccustomed strangeness, on the steps of our temple, once again in delight they cry, freedom, freedom, freedom. At the end of that, they wrote, please make as many copies of this leaflet as you can and distribute them. I feel like that's probably a good place for us to end. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Bye.